The Union of Planets had long sought new resources to fuel their growing empire. When their scouts identified Noral 7, a remote frozen world rich in rare minerals, the decision was swift: deploy a military task force and secure the planet. To the Union, this was just another conquest, another step towards strengthening their technological superiority. General Zuros, leader of the mission, stood aboard the command deck of his ship, overseeing the descent onto the icy surface below. Zuros was confident. His troops were well trained, equipped with the finest cold weather gear and advanced technology. The atmosphere of Noral 7, though punishingly cold, would pose no real threat to their armor-clad bodies. Victory, Zuros believed, was assured. As the dropships touched down, the planet revealed itself, endless plains of ice and snow, jagged mountains in the distance, all under a pale, gray sky. Lifeless. Desolate. Just the kind of place no civilization could thrive. The general smirked to himself. What threat could possibly exist here? Once on the surface, the soldiers fanned out, beginning their initial exploration. Their exocets hummed quietly as they moved across the frozen landscape, shields keeping them warm against the brutal cold. Still, there was an unease among the troops. The cold felt unnatural, as though it had a presence of its own. It gnawed at them, even through their suits, a constant reminder that they didn't belong here. Despite the discomfort, Zuros dismissed any concerns. The mission was too important to be delayed by mere discomfort. Unknown to them, they were being watched. High in the mountains and hidden beneath layers of snow, the Deathworlders observed the alien soldiers. The humans of Noral 7, long forgotten by the galaxy, had adapted to their environment over generations. To them, this was home. They had learned to live where no one else could. And now, they watched as outsiders landed on their world, unaware of the true danger they faced. The Union soldiers quickly established their forward base, constructing fortified structures that blended into the icy terrain. The mining equipment was set up, and extraction of the precious minerals began almost immediately. The initial signs of sabotage, a power failure here, a jammed drill there, were easy to dismiss. Zuros and his officers chalked it up to the cold, certain their superior technology would overcome any environmental hurdles. But as the days wore on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. A patrol went missing, vanishing without a trace in the frozen wasteland. When a search party was dispatched, they found the soldiers, frozen solid, standing upright, as though the cold itself had claimed them in an instant. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of a predator or attack. Just bodies, perfectly preserved in the ice. Zuros was stunned. The cold had been harsher than anticipated, but the technology should have protected them. The equipment, tested on dozens of worlds, was designed to handle any environment. Yet here, on this forsaken planet, it seemed to falter. The deaths were a mystery, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into the general's mind. The signs of sabotage grew more frequent. Power outages, equipment malfunctions, even communication lines cut without explanation. Every failure was blamed on the environment: ice clogging machinery, cold snapping cables. But the truth was far more dangerous than they realized. As the days wore on, the cold seemed to tighten its grip on the Union forces. Patrols sent out into the frozen wilderness often didn't return, their last transmissions garbled and filled with static. Those that did come back told strange stories: frozen equipment, unexplained failures, and eerie silences that stretched on for miles. General Zuros, once confident, now faced mounting frustrations. The advanced technology that had always been their strength was failing in the extreme cold. Exocets that were meant to regulate body temperature malfunctioned, weapons jammed, and communication lines regularly broke down. Their machinery, so reliant on precision, couldn't handle the environment. Every time a new issue arose, the general grew more agitated. Determined to regain control of the situation, Zuros ordered more aggressive scouting missions, sending larger squads to probe deeper into the terrain. He refused to believe that the primitive humans could be responsible for the mounting losses. To him, it was the cold, a natural force they simply had to outlast. Yet he underestimated the Deathworlders. These humans had lived their entire lives in these brutal conditions. They knew the terrain intimately and had adapted to the environment in ways the aliens couldn't imagine. The first large-scale assault came without warning. Under the cover of a howling snowstorm, the Deathworlders struck. Using their knowledge of the land, they moved silently through the snow, undetected by the alien scanners. They had no need for advanced equipment. Their clothing was lightweight, designed for mobility, and they had no visible signs of struggling with the cold. The Union soldiers, in contrast, were weighed down by their heavy gear, which had been designed for far milder environments. As the humans closed in, the aliens' tech once again betrayed them. Weapons froze, targeting systems shorted out, and mobility was reduced to a crawl as machinery seized up. The Deathworlders attacked with precision, targeting weak points in the alien lines. Their tactics were brutal and efficient: quick strikes, using the terrain to conceal themselves, then retreating back into the blizzard before the aliens could mount a proper defense. Casualties were high among the Union forces. The aliens were utterly unprepared for this kind of warfare. They were used to open battlefields and superior firepower, not fighting an enemy that blended seamlessly into the environment. In the midst of the chaos, alien soldiers marveled at the Deathworlders' resilience. How could these humans, with no visible protection against the cold, move so effortlessly through the storm? Where their own troops struggled just to stay upright in the freezing conditions, the humans attacked and retreated with terrifying ease. There were no signs of frostbite or exhaustion on their faces. It was as if the cold had no effect on them at all. After the brutal ambush, the Union forces limped back to their base, battered and disoriented. General Zuros stood in the command center, reviewing the reports. The losses were staggering. How could a handful of primitive humans inflict such damage? He scanned through footage from the battle, watching again as his soldiers were overrun by an enemy they couldn't even see clearly through the snow. The Deathworlders had taken full advantage of their home field, striking where the Union forces were weakest. The realization began to sink in: this was no ordinary enemy. The Deathworlders weren't just surviving in this harsh environment, they were thriving in it. Their knowledge of the terrain, combined with their apparent immunity to the cold, made them far more dangerous than Zuros had anticipated. He had come to this planet expecting to crush a primitive race, but it was now clear that the humans had the upper hand. Morale among the alien soldiers plummeted. The cold had been enough of a challenge, but now they faced an enemy that seemed to embody the planet itself. Fear crept into the ranks as stories of the humans spread. Whispers of the Deathworlders' strength, their unnatural endurance, and their seemingly supernatural connection to the cold filled the camp. Many began to wonder if they could survive much longer. Zuros knew that his forces were nearing their breaking point. The Deathworlders had turned the environment into a weapon, and his troops, despite their advanced technology, were ill-prepared for such a relentless foe. As the general stood overlooking the frozen landscape, he couldn't help but question whether they had made a terrible mistake coming here. The cold continued its merciless assault on the Union forces, and now their technology, once their greatest asset, was failing at an alarming rate. Communication systems, vital for coordinating troop movements and relaying orders, began to cut out entirely. The bitter cold seeped into every piece of equipment, corroding circuits, freezing components, and rendering the most advanced systems useless. Desperation took hold as the alien soldiers realized that without these tools, they were no better off than any other life form on this frozen planet. Vehicles that had been their lifeline, providing transport and shelter, now lay abandoned in the snow, their engines frozen solid and irreparable. With the breakdown of critical equipment, the Union soldiers found themselves stranded, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Rations, carefully calculated for the mission, froze into inedible blocks, and the emergency survival gear proved utterly insufficient against the brutal conditions. The cold was no longer just a background discomfort, it was an enemy in itself, one that their training had never prepared them for. As they huddled together in makeshift shelters, the air of confidence that had once defined their mission was gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The morale of the Union forces continued to plummet. What had started as minor malfunctions had now turned into a full-blown collapse of their infrastructure. The harsh reality of their situation set in as more soldiers succumbed not just to Deathworlder attacks, but to the cold itself. Some froze to death during routine patrols, their bodies found rigid and lifeless by the few still capable of venturing outside. Others, demoralized by the constant failures of their technology, abandoned their posts, convinced that they had been sent to die on this forsaken world. Disbelief spread like wildfire among the ranks. How could these Deathworlders, these primitive humans, continue to fight with such strength and endurance? The alien soldiers whispered among themselves, sharing stories of how the humans moved through the cold without heavy gear, their breath visible but their bodies seemingly unaffected. Some began to fear that these beings were more than human, that they possessed some supernatural ability to survive the planet's deadly conditions. The more they watched the Deathworlders endure, the more their own limitations became glaringly obvious. General Zuros, once certain of a swift and decisive victory, now stood on the brink of defeat. His forces were scattered, their equipment failing, and his commands slipping through his fingers. He spent long hours in his tent, staring at maps and data that offered no solutions. Reports of his soldiers' deaths mounted, both from human raids and from the cold itself. For the first time, he was haunted by the possibility that they had made a grave miscalculation. The Deathworlders were not a backward race to be easily conquered. They had mastered their environment in ways the Union had never anticipated, and Zuros was beginning to see just how unprepared they truly were. In a last-ditch effort to salvage the mission, Zuros made the decision to launch a final assault. The plan was simple: gather what remained of his forces and strike at the heart of the Deathworlder resistance. If they could crush the humans in one decisive blow, perhaps they could still claim victory. It was a desperate gamble, but one Zuros felt was necessary. His soldiers, however, were weary, demoralized, and unsure of their ability to execute such an attack. The constant failures of their technology had left them vulnerable, and the cold had become a relentless force they could no longer ignore. As the Union soldiers prepared for the assault, the Deathworlders were already one step ahead. They had anticipated this move and knew the aliens were on the verge of collapse. Instead of meeting the aliens head-on, the humans set up a series of traps, drawing the Union forces deeper into the most unforgiving parts of the wilderness. Here, the cold was even more intense, the terrain treacherous and unfamiliar. For the Deathworlders, it was home. For the alien soldiers, it was a death sentence. Both sides braced for the climactic battle, but there was an unspoken understanding among the Union forces. They were walking into a trap. The Deathworlders had proven themselves time and time again, and now, as the final assault loomed, it became clear that the aliens' hope of victory was slipping away. The cold, the humans, and their own failing technology had all conspired against them. Now, it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. The final assault began under the cover of another blizzard. The Union forces, battered and exhausted, moved forward with the last of their strength. General Zuros had rallied what remained of his troops, hoping that a concentrated push would finally break the Deathworlders. But as they trudged through the deep snow, it became clear the humans had anticipated every move. Traps, carefully hidden beneath layers of ice, slowed their advance. Explosions rang out as mines detonated, sending shards of ice into the air and causing panic among the ranks. The alien soldiers, weighed down by malfunctioning equipment, struggled to maintain formation. As they pressed on, the Deathworlders unleashed their next phase of attack. Snipers, hidden in the mountains, picked off alien soldiers one by one. The freezing wind carried the faint sounds of rifle shots, but by the time they were heard, another alien had already fallen. Their thermal imaging systems failed to detect the humans, who moved with ease through the storm, blending into the white landscape. Zuros watched in horror as his carefully planned assault crumbled. The soldiers, already weakened by the cold, were no match for an enemy that thrived in it. As the battle dragged on, the full extent of the Union's vulnerability became apparent. Their equipment, once the key to their superiority, now turned into a death sentence. Power cells froze, weapons jammed, and their armored suits locked up under the intense cold. The humans, moving without the hindrance of bulky tech, closed in on the remaining Union forces. Each skirmish turned into a rout, with the alien soldiers retreating in chaos, their numbers dwindling with each passing minute. Realizing that his forces were being wiped out, Zuros issued the order to retreat. But it was too late. The cold, now the deadliest enemy of all, claimed them. One by one, soldiers collapsed in the snow, their suits no longer able to protect them from the lethal chill. They froze where they fell, rigid and lifeless, their bodies blending into the landscape. The once mighty Union army was now little more than a collection of frozen statues scattered across the battlefield. Above, in orbit, the Union fleet watched helplessly as their ground forces were decimated. The realization that no reinforcements could change the outcome sank in. The commanders, unwilling to risk further losses, made the grim decision to abandon the mission. On the surface, the Deathworlders stood victorious. They had defended their home with precision and resilience, suffering minimal losses in comparison to the catastrophic defeat of their enemy. For them, the cold was nothing more than a familiar challenge, a constant presence they had long since mastered. Their ability to endure had proven to be their greatest weapon. The alien invaders, so reliant on technology, had failed to understand the true nature of their enemy, their ability to not just survive, but thrive in conditions that would have been unbearable to most life forms in the galaxy. As the last of the Union forces withdrew, leaving their dead behind, the Deathworlders gathered to reflect on their victory. The aliens had come with superior firepower, advanced tools, and an air of invincibility. Yet they had been undone by the very environment they had underestimated. The humans had no need for such tech, they had the planet itself on their side. Noral 7 had shaped them into a race that could withstand the harshest of trials, and they had proven that once again in the face of an overwhelming foe. The Union, now fully understanding the true power of the Deathworlders, left the planet in defeat. The lessons learned on Noral 7 would echo through their ranks for generations. They had thought the humans were merely primitive creatures, but they now realized the price of underestimating those who had adapted to survive where others would perish. As the Union ships disappeared into the void, one thing was certain: they would never return to this hostile world, where the cold itself had become a force of nature.